So these are like bags of mushroom substrate. They're not the prettiest looking things, but so it's basically like sawdust with some like cocoa coir. It's kind of like a mulch that's frequently used in soil, but they're inoculated with mushroom spores, and so we upcycle these bags from.
So what is upcycling?
So it's a term within sustainability. So this would otherwise be trash. We actually take these out of the trash from Windy City Mushroom. It's a company that we work closely with to recycle these, and so like Windy City Mushroom has these bags that are filled with mushroom substrate, which are the spores that mushrooms grow from, and so they produce mushrooms, and have a certain like quota that they need to meet per bag that they have, because the bags will take up shelf space and they need to have certain production. And so after 2 or 3 kind of like life cycles of mushrooms, these bags no longer become as fertile as they were when they were growing from like the conception. And so they toss these bags out, and we take them out, take the substrate out of the bags, and we'll incorporate that into our soil. And if we walk over here, I could start to show you kind of, we have like a little mushroom mound that we've started. And so yeah, we use that substrate, we break it down, and we'll add it to like our mushroom mound over here, which is not currently in season. And so we kind of build that up at the beginning of the season in spring, when like temperatures are a bit colder, and we'll like grow mushrooms here because that substrate still has mushroom inoculant in it. And so that's been something we've been kind of experimenting with, and it's been pretty successful. And so it actually seems so too, like we have a lot of weeds around here, and part of that is kind of just the capacity that we have to maintain the space itself. I'm the only employee who works here. I have 2 other farm partners who assist in like harvesting twice a week when we're here, and they'll also help like with various like projects that I'm working on here. But with that being said, like I have to be really intentional with like where I spend my time. And so
how do you not spend all your time just pulling weeds?
Yeah, and so that could like very easily be the case. And like I think that there are kind of like aesthetic issues that come with maybe not weeding as frequently as other farms do, but like that's not an effective use of my time, honestly. And so like when I weed in places that we're growing crops that it's like weeds are coming in high and are starting to like shade our crops, are competing with our crops, like that's essential. We need to weed that. But when we have like vacant rows here that like we are letting rest from like growing crops in, and during the off season we're going to amend with a bunch of our horse manure, a bunch of our mushroom inoculant, other compost. So like it might not look the prettiest. We have a lot of grasses growing here, but you don't want to leave soil bare. That's not a good practice to just have. And so I find it to be advantageous to my time is like I can leave this for now. We'll address this towards the end of the off season. Might not look the nicest, and to like maybe an untrained eye, it's like, oh, this just look like a lot of like weeds growing here. But we still grow over 10 tons of food here annually, and so we're able to have production goals and meet them without maybe having like the aesthetic pieces. But as we continue to like scale up our operations for next year, and we'll be able to bring on more employees to help, we'll be able to address those more like nuanced aspects of farming.
So those are more nuanced. It's not.
Yeah. And there are also different ways of like dealing with weeds in like passive way. So like what we have here is like we've mulched this essentially. So underneath these burlap sacks here, we have incorporated horse manure as well as compost into the soil, and we do a tilther, which is like a shallow tilling, and we will build the soil up, one, because like we physically want to maintain the soil's presence here. Each time you harvest, each time you weed, right, we take off and break off a lot of the soil that's attached to the roots, but there's always inevitably some soil that leaves the ground, and that's like our biggest asset here, right? That's the medium in which all of our plants are grown. And so it's very important for us to continue to like grow our soil physically to make sure that like we have enough soil. But then we also want to build the soil and its nutrient contents, because each time you grow a plant there, whether it's a crop, whether it's a weed, they extract nutrients to complete their life cycles, and we need to replenish that in order to grow healthy plants yeah, exactly. And so that also kind of goes into like how we weed. We do a lot of like mulching, and we can cover big swaths, and we can continue walking down this way, but we can cover, you know, big swaths of land and being able to like suppress weeds here. So there used to be a bunch of weeds in this row. I put this plastic down, and like these weeds will spring through, but this is a lot easier to pull than you know, an entire row of weeds. And so that's like one tactic that we have. But I have also like bigger tarps, bigger areas that like I just cover, and what's nice about that, it's actually like when you use plastic tarps like that, the technique is called solarization. Solarization, yeah. And so what it does is essentially like, and you want to use, like you need to use like dark colored plastics when you do it, but you basically cover.
It absorbs the sun.
Exactly. So it absorbs the sun. Underneath the tarp is like superheated, not like superheated like over. I think it reaches like, you know, 150 degrees, but that's hot enough to burn a lot of the seeds of weeds that have been in the ground there.
Really?
Yeah. And so what we'll do is cover a swath with plastic, and it's usually done during the winter when we're not required to grow, but we'll cover it. And for the winter months, it usually can happen, you know, in a matter of like 2 to 5 months, depending on the weather conditions. But then, you know, when we come back in spring, we're able to pull back the mold, pull back the tarp, and we have like beautiful clear soil that's like ready to plant immediately.
Yeah.
And so like that's the sort of thing too, where it's like, okay, we can have weeds in an area for a while. Again, it might not look the nicest at any given moment, but we can take care of it because we'll mulch it, and that's just like an effective way to do it that like I can do by myself. It doesn't require a team of 3-4 people here to help with that. But that's also like the weeding piece is also what we have like our volunteers help with, and a lot of times like that will be when we get a lot of weeding done, and a lot of times we turn beds over immediately, and we'll have to pull the weeds and then plant into it immediately. And so like mulching doesn't work for that case because we don't have months to spare to do that sort of thing. And so yeah, we do have a lot of grasses and things, but like over here we have a lot of our cucumbers growing, and I can look in here and see, we probably have some after the rains. But these are our cucumber plants, and again, it's approaching the end of the season, but here you can see one coming in here.
Oh, yeah, look at that.
Yeah, and so after a single rain, like you can start to see like they emerge pretty quickly. And yeah, we also harvest them a lot. We harvest them twice a week.
So it rained recently.
Yeah.
And you're saying they just come up?
The water content of cucumbers is really high, and like there are a number of vegetables. I mean, most vegetables have really high water content, but like when you think of things like tomatoes, like cucumbers, we grow watermelons as well. Watermelons are a little slower growing, but these things that have extremely high water content are like really impacted by precipitation. And so, you know, this past like weekend we've had 3 days of rain, maybe not consistent, but more rain than what's been occurring earlier in the summer. And so our next harvest day is Wednesday, and so we will come and harvest them on Wednesday. And this will be like, get a little bit bigger, but these are a nice variety. These are Japanese climbing cucumbers. And so
Japanese
climbing cucumbers. And you can see some of them start to grow up these. So this is lamb's quarters, but this is the cucumber. And some of them have like little tendrils that tie themselves to these. And so like if given a trellis like this one, right, it'll grow up them, and like it then can produce more cucumbers, just because that's how it grows naturally.
Something I'm curious, and maybe listeners and viewers are too, is where do you get your horse manure?
Oh, so we had previously, so this site, right, like as I explained earlier, was a vacant lot before. And like urban soils, specifically in Chicago, but like most urban soils around the world are like highly contaminated with heavy metals. And so like you can't grow, you can technically grow in there, but like any vegetable that is soil borne, so like potatoes, like a lot of lettuces, squash, things that will like be on the soil, like those things then have lead and heavy metals like on their exterior or in them. Those things aren't transferred to like the fruits of a lot of like crops. So like you could grow tomatoes in that. Still not a good practice. So our soil here has all been brought in, and it's been brought in from, before it was shut down, we got all of our manure from the Arlington racetrack. Out in Arlington
really?
Heights, yeah. So that's like they were paid. The resource center was paid to pick up the horse manure, and like what the horse manure is, it's like it's obviously like horse shit, but then they have like, it's mixed in with really fine wood chips. And so it's like partially cured, partially to like manure that would be used for fertilization and different things. So like what we did 3 years leading up to anything ever being planted here, we brought in soil and built this up. So like we're standing on, you know, what was like 6 to 8 feet of uncompressed manure that has been brought in, flattened, and we build the soil that way. And so every year we bring in more manure. And when we get back to the northern side of the farm, I'll show you these big piles of manure that we have. And so for bigger swaths, like where we don't have rows, like our winter squash that we're growing here, we just harvested over 1,000 pounds of them in 2 days. But we will, at the end of the season when the plants die, remove those plants, and because there aren't individual rows, we're gonna come in and add a whole new layer of manure. And like the manure itself is like really acidic when we first lay it down, so you can't plant directly into that. But when you give the winter, when we give it time over the winter to decompose, to start to break down, that's when it becomes like more fertile compost. So when we come back in spring, it will be broken down enough where we could plant directly into it, and a lot of our plants thrive in it. And so we do like annual tests, annual soil tests. And so like our, you know, heavy metal content is much less than like what is considered like lethal or just like dangerous. But it's also like much lower because like there wasn't lead, there wasn't heavy metals in the horse manure. But like also we need to understand that like in an urban setting, those sorts of heavy metals like arsenic and lead in particular are just exist in our air, and those things like don't decay like a lot of other elements. Like they don't decay over time, and so like that sort of sediment will always be in our environment. It's detected, it's known that like those things are, and so like those lead in particular is like activated by movement. And so like when you talk about like lead pipes, water moving through them is what transfers the lead from the pipe into people's bodies because they drink the water that comes from it. Lead paint, when homes are demolished or the paint's like scraped off, that agitates the lead, it becomes airborne. And so it's like a very light element. And so like that in cities there's ambient levels of those contaminants